Ethan had always enjoyed the quiet, predictable rhythm of suburban life. His neighborhood was a picture of stability, freshly cut lawns, well-maintained houses, and an unspoken understanding among neighbors to keep things civil. The homeowners association, for the most part, had been a background presence, sending out the occasional reminder about trash collection or holiday decorations but otherwise staying out of people's way. That was before Karen took over. Karen wasn't just an HOA president. She was a tyrant wrapped in pastel cardigans and a clipboard. From the moment she assumed power, she treated the neighborhood less like a community and more like her personal kingdom. She patrolled the streets as if she were a sheriff in some Wild West town, peering into people's yards, making notes, and issuing fines like they were going out of style. No violation was too small for her crusade. A mailbox slightly tilted? A written warning? A garden gnome in a front yard? A formal complaint? A lawn not trimmed to the exact HOA standard? A fine. Ethan had heard stories, everyone had. Karen's reputation spread quickly, and most homeowners either complied out of fear or learned to keep their heads down. He had been lucky, avoiding her wrath for months, but luck had a way of running out. It started with the looks. Whenever Karen passed by his house, her eyes would linger just a little too long on his driveway, her lips pursed in disapproval. Then came the passive-aggressive comments. "Oh, still parking in the driveway, huh?" she'd say with a smirk, as if he were committing a crime. At first, Ethan brushed it off. But then the letters started appearing, warnings taped to his front door, citing vague HOA regulations. He checked the bylaws himself. Nowhere did it say that parking in one's own driveway was against the rules. But that didn't matter to Karen. The whispers among neighbors soon confirmed what Ethan suspected: this wasn't about HOA policy. Karen had a personal grudge. Years ago, during her first run for HOA president, she had nearly won by a unanimous vote. Nearly. Ethan, believing in fairness and not wanting one person to have unchecked power, had voted for the opposing candidate. It was a single vote. But it was enough to cost Karen her perfect record. And she had never forgotten. Now, she had finally found her way to get even. Ethan had always considered himself a patient man, but patience had its limits. At first, he ignored Karen's letters, assuming she would get bored and move on to a new target. But she didn't. If anything, her obsession with his driveway escalated. The letters became more aggressive, citing obscure and vaguely worded infractions that seemed tailor-made for him. Then came the formal violation notices, printed on HOA letterhead, warning of potential fines if he refused to correct the problem. He knew better than to let her get under his skin. Karen thrived on confrontation, feeding off the frustration she created like it was some kind of sport. But as he watched her march up and down the street every evening, clipboard in hand, her hawk-like gaze sweeping over every property, he couldn't help but feel a slow-burning anger building inside him. She wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was rewriting them, bending them to fit whatever narrative suited her. And she wasn't even being subtle about it. The breaking point came when she held a last-minute HOA meeting, one she had barely announced in time for most homeowners to attend. Ethan, sensing trouble, made sure to be there. Sure enough, the meeting's main agenda was a necessary revision to parking regulations. With a sickeningly sweet smile, Karen explained that street and driveway parking created visual clutter and compromised neighborhood aesthetics. Her proposed solution? A new rule banning driveway parking entirely. But there was a catch. This rule will, of course, respect existing homeowner exemptions, she added smoothly. Longtime residents who were here before the amendment will not be required to make immediate changes. However, moving forward, all homeowners will need to comply. Ethan knew exactly what that meant. Karen and her closest allies, the ones she conveniently never fined for their overgrown hedges, poorly maintained fences, or gaudy lawn ornaments, would be grandfathered in. Their driveways could remain full of SUVs, trucks, even boats, without consequence. But newer residents, people like Ethan, would be forced to either use their garage exclusively or park down the street, far from their own homes. He wasn't the only one who noticed the unfairness of it all. A few homeowners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging wary glances. Someone cleared their throat, as if about to speak up, but Karen steamrolled ahead, ignoring any objections. When Ethan finally raised his hand, her smile didn't waver, but the sharp glint in her eyes told him she had been expecting this. "I have a question," he said, keeping his voice measured. "What about people who simply don't have space in their garages? What if they need their driveway for daily use? You're punishing homeowners for something that's never been an issue before." Karen tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "Oh, I completely understand, Ethan. But rules evolve, and it's important for us to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood. If you find yourself struggling to comply, well, maybe it's time to consider alternative arrangements." Alternative arrangements. The way she said it, with that saccharine politeness barely concealing the threat beneath, made Ethan's stomach turn. She wasn't just trying to inconvenience him, she was trying to push him out. That's when he realized this wasn't about HOA policies at all. It was personal. Neighbors whispered after the meeting, but no one directly challenged Karen. The rule change passed with barely any opposition, because by now, most people had learned that standing against her wasn't worth the hassle. Ethan left that night knowing one thing for certain: if he didn't fight back, Karen wouldn't stop until she made his life unbearable. The next morning, the official notice arrived. His car, parked in the same spot it had always been, was now in violation. He had exactly 24 hours to move it, or it would be towed. Ethan gripped the letter so tightly his knuckles turned white. This was the final straw. If Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one. But he wasn't going to fight on her terms. He was going to fight smart. Ethan sat at his desk, the violation notice still crumpled in his hand, his mind racing. Karen had pushed him too far. He wasn't just going to roll over and let her dictate how he lived on his own property. But he also knew better than to engage her head-on. That was exactly what she wanted, a fight she could twist in her favor, painting herself as the righteous enforcer of the HOA while making him out to be the problem. No, if he was going to take her down, he had to do it on his terms. And that meant playing by the very rules she claimed to uphold. He pulled out the HOA bylaws, the official document every homeowner had received when they moved in, the same one Karen conveniently ignored whenever it didn't suit her agenda. He had skimmed through it before when she first started harassing him, searching for any mention of driveway parking. But this time, he was looking for something else. Something that Karen herself was guilty of. It didn't take long to find it. A section detailing unauthorized property modifications caught his attention. Any external changes to a home, such as major renovations, expansions, or alterations to driveways, required formal approval from the HOA board and had to be reviewed by a committee. Ethan's pulse quickened as he thought back to Karen's house. She had expanded her driveway months ago, pouring fresh concrete to accommodate an extra parking space. He had assumed, like most people, that she had gone through the proper process. But now, he wasn't so sure. He grabbed his phone and took a walk down the street, casually passing by Karen's house. The extended portion of her driveway was obvious, a slightly different shade of concrete that had yet to fully blend in. He snapped a few discrete photos, then checked the HOA's official website for approved modification requests. As he suspected, there was no record of Karen ever filing for approval. That alone was enough to land her in violation. But Ethan wasn't done yet. The next section of the bylaws covered vehicle compliance, specifically a rule stating that all cars parked on the property had to have current registration tags. If a vehicle had expired tags, it could be subject to immediate towing, no warnings necessary. Ethan grinned as he remembered Karen's SUV, which had been sitting in her driveway untouched for weeks. He walked by again, this time glancing at the registration sticker on her license plate. Expired. Months overdue. It was almost too perfect. And then, he noticed something even better. Karen's SUV was parked along the curb in front of her house, but the spot she chose was technically classified as a fire lane. While there were no painted markings, the bylaws were clear: blocking emergency access, even in an unofficial fire lane, was a major violation. Ethan had everything he needed. He compiled his evidence: photos of her driveway expansion, the expired registration, and her car's illegal parking, and prepared to strike. But rather than confronting her directly, he decided to let the system do the work for him. He drafted an anonymous complaint to the HOA board, attaching every piece of proof, citing the exact bylaws she had violated, and making it clear that she had been breaking the very rules she ruthlessly enforced on everyone else. Then, for the finishing touch, he made a phone call. Karen had smugly threatened to have his car towed, using the HOA's contracted towing company to do it. So Ethan figured it was only fair to return the favor. Using an anonymous tip, he reported a vehicle in violation of multiple HOA regulations, Karen's SUV. He provided the location, the expired registration, and the details of the fire lane infraction. The tow operator on the other end confirmed that they would dispatch a truck that evening. Ethan sat back, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from satisfaction. Karen had spent months lording her authority over the neighborhood, bending the rules to suit her needs while punishing anyone who defied her. But now, she was about to experience what it felt like when someone played by her own twisted rulebook. And the best part? She wouldn't even see it coming. Ethan sat on his porch, casually flipping through a book, though he wasn't really reading. His eyes flicked to Karen's driveway every few minutes, anticipation thrumming in his chest. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, and then, right on cue, the distant rumble of a tow truck broke the evening stillness. He took a slow sip of his coffee, hiding his smirk behind the rim of the mug as the truck rolled to a stop in front of Karen's house. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand, and walked up to her SUV. Ethan watched as the man checked the license plate, pausing briefly before nodding to himself. He could only imagine what was running through the driver's mind: an HOA president violating her own parking rules? That had to be a first. Without hesitation, the man returned to his truck, lowered the tow hook, and within minutes, Karen's beloved SUV was being lifted onto the flatbed. The truck's orange hazard lights flickered, reflecting off the neighboring houses as the vehicle was secured in place. Ethan glanced around the street. A few neighbors had noticed the spectacle, stepping out onto their porches, exchanging hushed words and curious glances. The irony wasn't lost on them. Karen had been the one to threaten towing for years, lording her authority over everyone else. But now? Now she was just another homeowner getting a taste of her own medicine. The truck pulled away, Karen's SUV in tow, disappearing around the corner. Ethan exhaled slowly, relishing the moment. But as much as he enjoyed the sight, he knew the real entertainment would come in the morning. And he was right. The next day, as the sun crept over the rooftops, Karen stormed out of her house, her phone already pressed to her ear. She came to an abrupt halt in her driveway, staring at the empty space where her SUV had been. For a long moment, she simply stood there, unmoving, as if her brain refused to process what had happened. Then, in an instant, her entire body tensed, her face twisting into an expression of pure fury. She turned in a sharp circle, scanning the street, as if expecting someone to appear and confess to the crime. Ethan leaned casually against his doorframe, sipping his coffee, watching the show unfold. Karen's voice rose, sharp and indignant, as she barked into her phone. "What do you mean it was towed? That's impossible." A pause. "There has to be a mistake. No, I don't care what the paperwork says, I am the HOA president." Another pause. You think I violated the rules? Are you kidding me? Who reported this? She turned on her heel and stomped toward the center of the cul-de-sac, her head snapping back and forth, trying to lock eyes with someone, anyone, who might be responsible. But nobody met her gaze. Instead, neighbors casually went about their business, pretending not to hear her outburst. A few exchanged knowing looks, smothering their amusement behind polite indifference. Karen's face darkened. "This isn't over," she hissed, jabbing her finger in the air as if issuing a warning to an invisible enemy. Then, with a furious stomp, she spun on her heel and marched back inside. Ethan had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. But the real masterpiece was yet to come. Later that morning, Karen arrived at the HOA office, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she stormed inside. Ethan had anticipated this move. Karen, being Karen, wouldn't simply accept what had happened. She would demand answers. She would demand retribution. But for the first time, she wasn't the one in control. The receptionist, a woman named Lisa, barely looked up from her computer when Karen slammed her hands onto the counter. "I need to speak to someone immediately. My car was wrongfully towed." Lisa, unfazed, clicked her mouse a few times before retrieving a printed document. "Your vehicle was in violation of multiple HOA regulations," she said flatly, pushing the paper across the desk. "Expired registration. Unauthorized driveway expansion. Parking in a fire lane. Standard protocol." Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Then, her voice hit a new octave. "This is a mistake. My car wasn't parked illegally." Lisa's expression remained neutral. "We have photographic evidence." Karen snatched the paper up, scanning it quickly. When she saw the attached images, her own driveway, her own SUV, her own violations, her face turned an impressive shade of red. Her fingers clenched around the edges of the paper as if she were moments away from ripping it in half. "This is ridiculous," she spat. "Who submitted this complaint?" Lisa merely shrugged. "Anonymous report." Karen inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, but there was nothing she could do. She had been caught. The neighborhood was buzzing before she even returned home. By the time she stepped back onto her porch, phone still in hand, it was too late to contain the damage. Everyone knew. The HOA president, the same woman who had spent years bullying her neighbors, fining people for minor infractions, threatening homeowners into compliance, had been exposed. Ethan watched from his window as Karen stood on her porch, gripping her phone like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. Her reign was unraveling, and she knew it. And the best part? This was only the beginning. Karen had always believed herself untouchable, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, ruling with an iron clipboard and an unshakable sense of superiority. But the moment she saw the violation notice with her name on it, something inside her cracked. She had spent years bending the rules, punishing others for imaginary infractions, and silencing any opposition. Now, the very system she had weaponized had turned against her. By noon, the entire neighborhood was talking. The HOA board, under pressure from Ethan's anonymous complaint and the flood of whispers spreading through the cul-de-sac, had no choice but to launch an official review of Karen's tenure. What they found was worse than anyone expected. She had been funneling HOA funds into personal projects, selectively enforcing rules to punish homeowners she didn't like while giving free passes to her allies, and even violating major HOA policies herself. The driveway expansion? Unauthorized. The fines she issued? Many of them weren't backed by any actual bylaws. The board, embarrassed and cornered, called an emergency meeting to determine her fate. Karen stormed into the meeting, shoulders squared, ready to fight. She argued, blamed, even threatened legal action, but the walls were closing in. One by one, residents stood up and shared their grievances, stories of unfair fines, of ignored complaints, of a woman who had ruled through intimidation rather than leadership. When the board presented the hard evidence, she knew there was no way out. The vote was unanimous. Effective immediately, Karen was removed from her position as HOA president. The neighborhood erupted in quiet celebration. The suffocating atmosphere Karen had created was gone overnight. People left their trash bins out a little longer, kids rode bikes down the street without fear of a ridiculous fine, and Ethan? His car remained exactly where it had always been, parked in his own driveway, untouched, just as it should be. But Karen, even in disgrace, refused to accept defeat. She threatened to sue, but no one took her seriously. She tried to rally support, but her former allies had already distanced themselves, unwilling to go down with her. She even attempted to run for HOA president again the following year, but when the votes were counted, she received exactly 0. Eventually, Karen put her house up for sale. She couldn't stand living in a neighborhood where she no longer held power, where people laughed behind her back instead of cowering in fear. The day she packed up and drove away, Ethan stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching as she disappeared from his life forever. With Karen gone, the neighborhood found peace, but the scars she left behind remained, a warning of what happens when one person is given too much power. Because at the end of the day, HOA rules aren't just about maintaining a community. In the wrong hands, they become a weapon. And the only way to win is to fight smarter. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.